words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Marjorie Pedersen was a lady who belonged to this church for many, many years. She died about 10 or 12 years ago at the age of 100. During the time that she was a member here, she was treasurer, first early on, and then she had a hiatus, and then probably the last 25 years of her life, she was also the treasurer up until the time she died. Marjorie's head, no matter when you talked to her, was completely clear. She was as good with her brain as a 20-year-old would be. Her favorite expression in her 90s, and this always caused those of us who heard it to smile, was, "Preserve me from old people." Now, they didn't get much older than Marjorie, many of them younger, but nevertheless, that was something she said over and over. Preserve me from old people. Because her head, you see, was perfect. Her brain was clear. Others were not. If you'd ask me if I would say the same thing, I would not, but I would say something like, preserve me from all those who have fancy degrees who are really stupid. And this is the problem that St. Paul was facing as he wrote the letter to the Corinthians. Corinth is a city in Greece, has been for centuries, and the Greeks were proud of their background. Some 300 years before Paul, there were the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And they set a foundation for the way the Greeks would think. They began to examine their world and to look at it in all aspects. And these philosophers put together a way of thinking about the world. And so this carried down through the generations. This was their wisdom, you see. But now Paul comes along and he wants to tell the people about a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah who was crucified on a cross and whom God raised. And they couldn't buy into it. What are you talking about? Why would God raise someone who was crucified? That doesn't make any sense. We have gods, and yeah, the Greeks had a pantheon of gods. Each one was powerful in his own right and did this, that, or the other thing. And none of them, you see, died. Didn't make any sense. And so the message that Paul was bringing to them was foreign. They rejected it. It was foolishness as far as they were concerned. The Jews had a similar problem, and there were Jews living up in Greece. The Jews looked at this message of Paul, and they said, but in the scriptures, and that would be our Old Testament, in the scriptures it says that anyone who is hung on a tree, on a cross, is rejected by God. How can you then say that God raised him from the dead? Why would he do that if he was rejected by God? Didn't make any sense, you see. Today we have a similar problem. From the 17th century to the present, science has dominated our society. In the 17th century, people began to look at the world through the eyes of science, trying to do experiments, trying to explain the world. Early on, things happened frequently accidentally. A chemist, for instance, might be working with some sort of chemical, and it spilled accidentally on something else. And all of a sudden, there was a reaction which he hadn't experienced, hadn't expected, and yet he was able to use that. Today, things go so fast that it's hard to believe because we know how to do experiments. The world came down with this coronavirus, COVID, and we were able in a very short time to develop a vaccine. Was it perfect? Did it prevent you from getting it at all? No. But it prevented you from getting a very bad case of it. That would kill you. Work still needs to be done. But scientists knew how to go about trying to find a solution. They would, they would look at the problem and ask questions, one after another, trying to answer them. And methodically, they'd go through one thing after another until they came up with a solution. I remember when I was a boy, my next door neighbor got one of the first televisions. The console was enormous. It was, 4 feet, 5 feet off the ground. And the picture was about 6 inches. But it was a TV, something new. It wasn't too long before they made that screen larger. And when we finally got a TV, it was 13 inches, imagine. To our standards today, it's tiny, not just small. And eventually, 21 inches was the maximum. If you had a 21-inch TV, boy, you were in heaven. It was fabulous. But they had these big cathode ray tubes, and you needed a big console to house this. That's what made the picture. But there were people out there saying, we surely can do this better. And they developed a TV that didn't need this cathode ray. And so today we buy TVs, what are they? About 2 inches thick. You can hang them on the wall, any wall. They can come up to maybe, 5 feet across. It's amazing how, we've progressed. And it's daily. What you take home today from the store becomes obsolete. Because tomorrow you can literally buy something better, something newer. When the first men landed on the moon, they had a computer, but in terms of today, it was primitive. And on the way down to the moon's surface, the computer told Armstrong to abort the mission. It wasn't going right. The computer couldn't take in all of the data that was being fed into it. But Armstrong was a test pilot. And he said, I didn't come this way for nothing. And so he looked out the window and he manually landed the LEM seconds before it ran out of fuel. Today, all of us have a phone in our back pockets, an iPhone. And that iPhone today has more computing power than they had on the first landing on the moon. It's really amazing. But what we do now, you see, is to say, all right, we want to examine everything. And you say there's God, but we'll examine him. The problem is that no one can examine God because God is outside of creation. He was beyond creation and was therefore able to create. He is not part of our creation. And so we can't see God, we can't sense God. None of our devices are able to examine God. And so scientists often will say, well, if we can't see it or detect God in any way, he doesn't exist. But not all knowledge comes from the way science works. Someone says to you, I love you. And that does something to you right away. And the response is often, I love you too. But how do you prove that? How do I know that you really love me? Or how do you know that I really love you? We can look at what someone has done for us in the past, and it's loving. We can see what they're doing today. But will they do the same thing tomorrow? We don't know. We have to trust. We have to believe what the words of the person is saying are true. That's all. But that's a way of knowing, which is different from the way science knows. And when Paul comes along and says that God worked through the cross, he says something that we need to believe. Since we couldn't discover God because we don't know what God is like at all, God approached humankind. He first revealed himself to Abraham. Abraham, pack up all your things, your animals, your family. I'm going to move you to a place and give you a land that will be yours. And he approached others. He revealed himself to others. And finally, in Jesus, he was incarnate into a human being, into a baby who was laid on a bed of hay. They saw him do miracles. They heard his words of love. They saw him hang on a cross as he died. And they saw him 3 days later alive. And Paul says, I saw him too. He appeared to me. And because he's alive, that means that God caused him to be alive. God resurrected him. And that means that God was working in Jesus on the cross. And so the cross, the crucifixion, becomes important. It's two sides of a coin, the crucifixion and resurrection. And so this is what he preaches. And so the only way that this makes any sense to us is to believe it. To trust that word. And as we trust it, we find it to be true. What does Paul say again here in the last couple of verses? He says, consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not too many of you were wise by human standards, and not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. The wisdom of God is crazy to us. It doesn't make any sense that God works through someone who was crucified. And yet the wisdom of God is greater than ours. And what we consider foolishness is the way God comes to us. God reaches out to us so that everyone, no matter how poor, how lowly in the world, can see God, can hear his offer of love, and can respond to it. Amen. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Our next hymn is 697.